perhaps we should remind everyone to get their favourite Java IDE open. So we'll be getting to a practical part of the exercise later on, but I'm going to start with an introduction to the three things that are mentioned here on the slide. Why am I doing this then? Two reasons. One is that originally I was intending to do a lightning talk, and I've done a couple of them already, and the third one, which is going to be the hat trick that I could be really smug about, I completely missed. Well, I just completely forgot about it, and so I've taken something that was going to be a lightning talk and spent a bit more time thinking about it, as you do, and it's actually fleshed out into this presentation and exercise tonight. And yeah, the other reason I wanted to do this is because I've spent quite a number of years hearing about domain-driven design, and not that much time sat with developers who are actually making use of the patterns and practices from domain-driven design. So I'm always a little bit disappointed about that. I think DDD has I think it's helped me become a better developer in some ways. Regardless of language, even though what we're talking about tonight is an object-oriented context, I think some of the what are known as the strategic patterns in domain-driven design and the tactical patterns, which the group might already be familiar with, because we've had a couple of DDD sessions, I think, here already. I came a year or 18 months ago or something, and someone did a really good session on why the strategic patterns and the tactical patterns of DDD actually exist, and why it's important to not focus too much on one particular part of DDD, to become too familiar with the tactical patterns and disregard the strategic patterns. It can be quite risky and quite useless in some ways as well. So I remember that presentation being quite kind of reinforced my beliefs, and I remember going away and expecting to see a lot more sort of domain-driven design in my sort of evaluation of other people's code, and in other teams that I've been visiting over the last couple of years. I was expecting to see some evidence of domain-driven design in the thinking in the teams and in some of the projects, or even on some of the legacy stuff. But still, I don't really see very much of it. So I'd like to, first of all, hear maybe from you guys a little bit about your exposure to it, to get some idea of who's familiar with it in the room and who's actually made some use of it. So, can you put your hands up? Well, yeah, let's do hands. Can you put your hands up if you have, if you're familiar with domain-driven design? Okay. And those of you that you would say you use it quite regularly, or have been in situations where it's come into your daily work, or at least it's crossed your mind, should we say that? Anyone? Yeah? So it's usually quite a bit less, yeah. Domain-driven design seems to be something that people really, really, really want to understand and really, really, really want to do, but finding the opportunities has been quite hard. So what I've done here, the example that we'll play with later in the code, and the example that I'll take you through in the slides, I've basically built a fairly contrived organisation based on banking. That's perhaps no surprise to those of you that know that I've ended up working with banks for a long time, not particularly through choice, but it's something that the company I work with at the moment, they work with a lot of financial organisations, and doesn't matter how big or small they are, you know, they do tend to have large operating models and large domains that are very often not evident in the speech or in the behaviour of the people who are building the applications. So I decided to build this fictitious bank and invite some of my colleagues to start playing with the code and to start thinking about how the real bank code that we're working on might benefit from some of the domain-driven design ideas. So I'll take you through that first. Now I know roughly how people are with domain-driven design. How do people feel about shouting out questions or saving up to the end? Because I really don't mind. I don't mind being instructed. If that's what people like to do. How does it normally go? Save up questions, or I don't mind. What will work best? Go on then. Someone's bound to. So there'll be the first third of this will be me going through the example, and then we'll the second third of this we'll clone the repo, and it's over to you guys to try and help solve the problem. It's a problem that I see quite a lot in teams that are equipped with certain languages, object-oriented languages, certain frameworks, certain web frameworks, such as the MVC style stuff, and are placed in certain domains like banking. So let's take you through the example anyway. So this is this is a fictitious organisation, but you could say it's it has been inspired by some financial organisations, some organisations I'm familiar with, my colleagues are familiar with as well. So I'll take you through this. The organisation that appears ripe for domain-driven design and appears to need it in some way is looking a lot like this. So in our example, it's governance heavy. Probably don't need to explain that too much, because I think the perception of financial organisations is that governance creeps into just about every part of it. A large part of governance in what we do in the work for banks is actually around risk. And as we look at the domains in the financial organisation model, risk will be central to that, and part of the coding exercise will be about how we use language to describe risk. Well understood operating model, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I don't think all of these points that you'll see are all bad, right? These larger organisations have to have target operating models, and they tend to always be changing. They are incremented, iterated on. It's not necessarily a bad thing to see an operating model change and flow as the organisation does. But the way it affects our domain-driven design thinking is quite interesting. More to that. So again, typical financial organisation would be mature enough to perhaps benefit from some of the strategic patterns of DDD. So any of you that have been to some of the other domain-driven design sort of presentations or read some of the books on DDD will recognise the advice given of please don't neglect the strategic patterns over the tactical patterns. So some of the tactical DDD patterns that we all know about are things like the service pattern, the repository pattern, entities, things like that. Okay, all the stuff that has been around object-oriented code for forever and has been implemented in bad ways and good ways. Another key point of this is that the teams that appear to be keen to embrace some of these tactical patterns, so they have a good understanding of how their language of choice, or their language of the language that's been imposed on them basically by the organisation in a lot of ways, is quite can be quite expressive and use an expressive way with the domain-driven design tactical patterns. So we'll come around to that a bit. These organisations as well, what I've found is that, and this is a personal note, is what I'd like to hear from these kinds of places that are looking at DDD is that they should be starting to frame conversations in terms of behaviours in their organisation. So this again is getting away from this idea that entities and states is the be-all end-all of their operations. Yes, admittedly, these financial organisations, there are a lot of state flies around. There's a lot of integration between a lot of systems, a lot of messaging and so on and so forth. But the conversations tend to be, what I found is they tend to be based around what state certain things should be in. And persistence as well is a major talking point. And the value of the behaviours tends to slip through, I find. And that's the next point, that I believe they should be less concerned about entities and data. And the last point about our fictitious organisation here, I believe they should be asking whose domain is it anyway. This was an article I read, I don't know if anyone else has seen it, it was Dan North's blog post about 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago. And it was the single most accurate and interesting depiction of BDD activity and how it can go wrong and how it can drift into useless BDD if you fail to recognise that there's more than one stakeholder in almost every story or every scenario. And yeah, ignore your stakeholders at your peril. There'll be stakeholders hidden away in the dark in your organisation, and it's time to let them have a say and come out of the woodwork. So, whose domain is it anyway? It's a question that comes up a lot in domain-driven design, I find. So that's setting the scene for the organisation we're going to talk about. A little bit about the strategic picture. So, domain-driven design isn't always about developing systems. Yeah, it's a lot of it's about communication. So, in the same way that behaviour-driven development is a lot about the right sort of behaviours and conversations happening between different parts of the organisation. The strategic picture in domain-driven design is very often just about different functions of the business having time to talk to each other about what they do, and explaining a little bit about their systems, but not solely concentrating on let's develop a system, let's build something to solve the problem. Yeah, it's very often just about how it aligns to the operating model, how that particular function of the business aligns to the operating model. Yeah, they might have a whinge about their monolithic systems. They might say, that their systems are not doing them any favours. But
can I just ask, when you say operating model, you're not talking about anything technical. You're talking about how the business is structured and does what it does.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So this is where, if you're going to talk about the two halves of domain-driven design, the tactical and the strategic, what I find is that whenever I'm talking to people about some of the strategic patterns, such as context maps and things like that, it's usually coming out of conversations around the operating model and around the problems that they have in their particular function in the business. So this is really wide-scale stuff. We're not going to touch on this tonight. I don't think we can cover any of that stuff. And the coding exercise that we do is very, very simple. It's not going to allow us to get into operating models or anything like that. But it does exist. That kind of picture I find exists where monolithic systems and stovepipes are scattered throughout the organisation. And yes, everything closely aligns to an operating model, and the operating model does iterate, and it seems to be alive and useful, but still no one seems very happy with it. Okay. Heavily specified and documented. Okay, so you can tell me whether you think that's a bad idea or not. I'm not going to make a value judgment on that. I work with organisations that insist on that. I also work with other quite forward-thinking organisations that have different views, but the last one is quite interesting. Is that I find these strategic pictures always tend to have they tend to be crying out for a ubiquitous language. So this is another feature of domain-driven design that I think is quite well known by most people who get involved in it, and also people who do things like behaviour-driven development. I tend to start to surface in a ubiquitous language, and people start to find that quite a useful thing and don't want to let go of it once it's happened. So here's an example of a strategic use case. So this is something where we could implement a lot of this without even writing a line of code. Okay? This is something that you could go to a certain part of your operating model and say, well, the call centre deals with that now, or the postal part of the business deals with that now. And it's not something that we're going to solve with the code tonight. We're going to be solving a tactical domain-driven design problem. But this I thought was quite a good way of contrasting between the strategic and the tactical. So the background here is that, well, I'll just read it out word for word. So again, bear in mind this is a fictitious organisation, but yes, I see this quite a lot in financial organisations, and you probably recognise it. Does anyone here actually work for a financial organisation for a start?
Do they?
Okay. Did they? Yes. Well, right. Yes, absolutely. I remember you saying about that. Yes. So the background here is that. Okay, try to think about ubiquitous language when you read something like this. So the process of converting a visitor to an account-holding customer is heavily governed by financial regulators. Our organisation, our fictitious one we're looking at tonight, has recognised the importance of customer verification. They'd be out of business if it didn't. In the operating model, and has established a discrete risk function in the business which houses a customer due diligence team. Right, there's quite a lot covering that. Well, there'll be systems, there'll be web-based systems or tablet handheld systems. Something we built recently for Lloyds was just entirely tablet-based. It was to do with CRM, and it was to do with due diligence. It's not something that everyone will, expect to see in an organisation like that, but these kinds of things, these kinds of functions are very prevalent in financial. So these strategic use cases, the first point here is that they're going to demand some kind of cross-domain collaboration. Right? There's no way that you're going to be able to get to grips with some of the finer points of this use case of verifying the identity of a customer and enabling them to become effectively a partner with you as an account holder. You're not going to be able to solve any of those problems without speaking to other parts of the business. Okay. There's going to be a high likelihood of misunderstood concepts, and we'll get around to that in a minute. It could benefit from some of the BDD practices and some of the language that BDD expects you to use. And of course, because we've got cross-domain issues, so we've got customer due diligence system here, which is all about verifying customers, and another system over here which is about onboarding customers, and another system here which is about servicing the account. Well, all this data and state integration that happens between these different systems is going to require you to think about anti-corruption. So this is something, again, in domain-driven design, one of the strategic patterns is that's quite a nice compliment, that. So anti-corruption layers and things like that do tend to come up in this. Right, so now we can actually start to draw up very, 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 very simple domain picture based on what we just talked about there. So in domain-driven design, these are domains. And they're the simplest ones I could think of for this example. So two big circles are discrete domains, yeah? Account opening is what we're doing. So the strategic use case is about how do we better onboard customers, give them accounts, give them products or whatever. So naturally you're going to have an expression of certain entities. Can't get away from that. A lot of what I see in these systems is a slight obsession on entities and data, like I mentioned earlier. So customer and the identity of a customer are defined somewhere. They might be written in test cases, in functional requirement documentation, stuck in someone's head, or whatever. So the account opening function of a business is just imagine one floor of a building, okay, with account opening on it. And their idea of what a customer is and what the identity of a customer is, right, is entirely different to the risk floor. So there's another floor on the bank, that's concentrating on all the risks. So you'll have financial risk, regulatory risk, remediation, all that stuff. And their idea of a customer is completely different. They look at a customer from scoring their identity and scoring their risk profile. Yeah. So they deal with a customer in a completely different way. These guys want to bring in a customer as fast and smooth as possible and give them an account and allow them to get this relationship with the organisation. They know they have to go through this verify step. And this verify here is actually behaviour. So customer and identity are just imagine plain old Java objects, you know. Imagine a stakeholder of some sort, or even a data table, doesn't matter. Verify is different, that's behaviour. And then right on the other side, customer over there is different. So if you...
Sorry.
Yeah.
On the use case description,
yeah,
you had the word visitor, I think.
Yes.
Where does that live in? Where does that live in this picture?
Right, yeah. I took it out of that, but it does come back later. No, it's all right. it comes back in a later slide because it's worth talking about that actually, because there's a kind of language that's built up in this organisation around what people are. Okay, so they're either visitors, prospects, applicants, or account holders. If they're an account holder, they're a customer. Okay, so what you'll see in the code example is just some boilerplate code, some really light skeleton stuff of me quickly writing some classes to represent these things. And it's up to us to maybe solve some of the problems. But yes, customer, by the time they're a customer, they've been through a state transition. You know, from being a visitor, they've been promoted, they've clicked a few pages, they've taken an interest, blah, 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 they've signed up, they've become a prospect because we've got some details from them, and then they become an applicant, and so on. So that's a very cut down domain. Now there's a subdomain inside risk, and we'll see this in the code actually. So there's a very, very clear and naive, deliberately naive I think, mapping between this and the code, right? The Java packages and this. And what you'll find is that under the risk domain, there's something called customer due diligence. So I've drawn a circle around the customer because a customer coming in through account opening, if they had it their way, they would get as many customers in as possible and have all their accounts open and be earning lots of revenue. The guys over here have different ideas. They want the customer to go through the CDD process to have their identity verified. So now we've got completely duplicate definitions here. Under account opening, we've got customer verifying an identity, and under customer due diligence, we've got customer verifying identity. Right. So they're just domains. There's no technological bounding context here at all. These ideas aren't bound by anything. There are no systems on this picture. Yeah, there are no real processes until we do that. So, in a lot of the domain-driven design literature, you'll see dashed lines representing bounding contexts. So I'll just use the same sort of visualization, really. Now, what's interesting about this is that what this is trying to say is that the account opening function of the business has one bounding context, one system to do that. So when you go on the account opening floor, everybody on that floor is using the account opening platform. Everyone's using the same web app or whatever that enables them to take customers through to account opening. Over in customer due diligence, the dashed lines are completely separate. You might see in an organisation where those dashed lines go right the way over there, yeah? So they encompass CDD as well. What that would be telling you is that the account opening function, the same system that they use to open accounts, is also used to verify customers. But in our example, we've got two entirely separate systems. This is some web app portal or something, and this is a third-party piece of software that is, by Experian or something that's specifically designed to help you verify customers and prove that they are who they say they are. So that's typical domain-driven design, very light modelling really. You would scribble some domains down based on the conversations you've had, There's a little note down there about it not always being a technical thing, which, yeah. And then you start drawing these dashed lines around to describe the systems that are actually being used. And this is the last bit of the sort of strategic part of this. There's always something that needs to happen here, right? So if there's going to be any seamless customer onboarding and some risk profiling of that customer, there's a big question mark here. So what are we saying? We're saying those two systems have to integrate. So when the customer's got to the third page of signing up for their account, he goes off to the customer due diligence platform and verifies them, and then comes back and allows them to continue. There's always some integration that goes on in these systems, and that's what that question mark is. And the reason it's a question mark, I was hoping someone here might be able to tell me what normally goes in there. If you've done domain-driven design before, there's a bunch of strategic domain-driven design stuff that goes in that question mark bubble there. Does anyone know what it is?
Anti-corruption.
Yeah, so that would be one of the things that goes in there. Yeah, definitely.
Isn't it the set of options? There's a list of options of how do you deal with those two things, of which anti-corruption layer is one.
Correct. Yeah.
And one team saying, okay, we'll borrow the other guy's definitions.
Exactly that. So you might have.
So it's about how you're going to deal with the issue.
Yeah, exactly. So you might have. I mean, in our code example, none of that's there. It's all completely flat. And it's really simple Java. But you might have an integration system which has a canonical object model, for example, that maps all the customers to one canonical idea of a customer. Or you might have this piece of behavior here kicking off a call to an API over here. And yes, anti-corruption layer would go in here, and a context map would as well. So that's what you're describing there. The context map in DDD is the difference between a customer over there and a customer here. The names are exactly the same. There has to be something that distinguishes them.
Is that arrow intended to appear to be between the two contexts or between the two variables?
Well, I think, yeah, I've drawn it so that it's on verify, because I think that's the interesting point of this, is that verify is the only bit of behaviour in all of that. So I'm trying to sort of explain that's the thing that's going to happen.
Sorry, I'm repeating what you wrote.
That's all right. It helps me.
So when I was at one of the DDD conferences this year, the way that Eric Evans was kind of describing that, and the language between the two domains was a bit like if you had two people sat in the room, one was French and one was German.
Yeah.
What language do they speak to each
Yeah.
other to understand?
Yeah, it's very much like that. And it happens a lot in
Exactly.
BDD.
This is where it comes in. So when you're sharing between contexts, you do have to make that decision of which language do you talk about between those contexts. So is it that actually we've got an Englishman and a German in there, the German man and the Dutch man in there. Do they speak? They would both speak in English because that's where it comes from. But they've got a common language that they would go to. So there's a lot of decisions around that.
Yeah, there is, and if you look at the bullet points down here, I think that's worth pointing out that they've got shared naming. So the guys over in CDD, they are convinced that a customer is this shape and it always should be that shape. It's got the same name as it does over here, but there's just no shared definition or shared understanding. And this is this shared language. It's not there, is it? It's not.
It's a nice revelation for me how it's there.
Yeah, it is. It's a really good way of looking at context maps, which is the way of resolving the language. Canonical object models are used for that sometimes. So that's a question mark in there, because we're not going to do that. It takes too long. Right, so the tactical picture is actually what we're going to dig into now. So the strategic picture is just a bunch of functions of the business, really busy, building their own systems that solve their own problems, not really collaborating with each other, not really talking to each other about their definitions of what a customer is, what an account is, and just keeping themselves to themselves. The tactical picture would be one team having a certain set of technologies imposed on them and having to just build stuff to solve problems. So the tactical picture here is that there's an opinionated framework. What you'll have here is Spring MVC. I've made it deliberately typical. Arbitrary behaviour containers, right. You'll see in the code in places like this where Have you ever seen, I don't know, a class called service? I've never seen a class called service. They don't exist, no. Talking to, I think we was talking to Mark about it. Yeah, I just call them arbitrary behaviour containers because code like this tends to have, instead of having some expression of what it means to verify a customer, they just have a verification service. And it starts attracting just tons and tons of code. It's just soaks up technical debt like a sponge. And they become massive, don't they? That type of thing there can lead to something called an anemic domain model, which is the same way of saying, you know, you can express your customer verification, their identity, their account opening in terms of entities and messages between entities, or you can just stick them in services. And if you stick them in services, your domain model won't be expressing anything. There won't be any behaviour in there, just be able to state. You know. It'll be very, very boring indeed. And that's the whole topic on its own. There'll be overlooked concepts. So, the thing that Kevin picked up on there was the thing that's deliberately slipped through the net on that slide was the idea that there's some transition to happen between a visitor, a prospect, an applicant, and a customer. And we've kind of lost that concept because when teams are thinking tactically about this stuff, they just want to solve their own problem. And there'll be some unexplored patterns as well. So because they've been told by, you know, an architect or something to work in Spring MVC and to work in a sort of layered fashion, they might not have considered some hexagonal stuff or CQRS. Very, very complementary to domain-driven design. They work very well with it, as hopefully you'll see on the next thing. So this is just before we get to our code exercise. So the exercise that we'll be doing is all about still onboarding the customer, still taking the customer through the process of getting an account, but trying to find a way of reminding them when they need to revisit the process and carry on where they left off. So the background here is that a visitor may abandon at any time during the account application process. By the time they do this, the organisation will have their email address, therefore they can be considered a prospect. So this is where they've gone from being a visitor to being a prospect. Okay? It's beneficial to remind prospects that they have incomplete applications. It's a bit vague, but what we're trying to say there is the organisation can benefit by reminding prospects that they have an application that's incomplete and they might want to come back and complete it. So this again sort of gets back to that idea that there's more than one stakeholder in this. There are lots and lots of different domains. There'll be someone in marketing who wants to know about prospects. You don't want to know about prospects right now, you just need to know about customers. Because when you make that call to the mainframe to open the account, you just need a blob of customer data. But there'll be someone in marketing who wants to know when that visitor has become a prospect because they want to take that email address and start spamming the customer. So that's a very important missing idea that hopefully domain-driven design will help sort of bring out. Again, multiple channels, it's not really that important, but I'll show you in the next time. You could deliver all of this use case within a tactical scope. I'll explain that tactical scope. There are certainly different definitions for visitor, prospect, and applicant. Again, something that we need to consider. You can't just consider everything in customer. You're likely to find other missing concepts when you do this kind of exercise. So the tactical implementation is, again, it's prescribed technology. It's an object-oriented, and some people will hate this, and I always hate this. It's an object-oriented language, so it's Java. And the features of the language have been completely neglected. So it's just got a bunch of service classes in there and procedural code that just calls methods on these service classes to do stuff. So there's no exploitation of the object-oriented nature of the code. It's obsessed with tiers as well, of layering stuff into tiers. Again, a lot of talk about implementing this feature in terms of persistence. So why don't we just save off customer data? That's the most important thing ever. We need to do that straight away. We need to do big spikes to make sure there are databases and things like that. When we do the exercise, you'll see none of that's required. And there's this emphasis again, people are going to start looking for intrinsic value in entities. They're going to start looking at what's valuable about a customer and what's valuable about an applicant. And that obsession on entities is to the well, I mean, basically, it might be to your advantages as a team that deals with customers, but if you don't dig into the behaviours and you just think about the entities, you're going to miss something that another part of the organisation might be really, really interested in. So we'll get to that in a example. And the way we're going to do this is we can get the code example open now. All of what I just said about strategic and tactical will probably be a lot clearer, but we're going to try to preserve all of these domain things by using this hexagonal architecture. So this is something that goes extremely well with domain-driven design if it's done from the beginning. I find it works very, very well. Where all these ideas, the use cases for taking a customer through to the completion of an account, the use case for verifying a customer, making sure that they say they are who they say they are before they get the account. All of that detail of the domain can really be preserved very well if you go about it with this kind of architecture. So we'll have a look at that in the code. So you might go into declaring commands and queries. That's more of a CQRS thing. Don't really have time to look at that. There will be an emphasis on interface roles and behaviours. So again, when I come for a walk around and have a look at the code, that will be clear. And hopefully it will lead to some surprises. So there's the idea that when you see the session, it becomes a first-class idea, first-class concept. So this is the no, actually that's not the repo. I need to show you that first. Okay, let's just go back a couple of slides. There you go. So we need to start cloning some code from these repos here, and then I'll come round. So we'll take kind of, actually, any questions before we do that? Because I've run through like tons of stuff there. We've covered strategic patterns in domain-driven design and tactical patterns, and 2 use cases. It's a hell of a lot to cover. We need to think about, clarifying some of those things. So, does anyone know what this is? What we're trying to do with this? No. Questions? Let's get more questions going because that will help.
Can we just take a look at the code and try and work it out? And then we can
That's
I think maybe try and relate that to that.
As soon as you see the code, you'll see the problem to solve. Because imagine all of this is just the business of locking on concepts, okay? Until you get to the code, it's just documentation. So have a look at the code and compare it to what you've heard me talk about, and then we'll try and solve the problem. And then we've got another problem to look at after that. Which
Do we need both of those repos?
Good question. I wouldn't bother with run the bank. Now, run the bank is just a vagrant box which allows you to, if you haven't got a Java, like a Tomcat runtime or anything, you can use that to run it. But probably the best thing to do is just look at the code. So just do the first repo, which is just the bank.